All right. Good afternoon. My name's Tom Wilson. I'm the CEO of Hyper, a service framework that's also open source, and run the Charleston JS Meetup. Today, we'll talk a little bit about testing. As you know, this meetup is focused on Node.js, and I'm planning in the future to have more guest speakers lined up. Next week, we have Scott Sandman talking about React Query, which will be really cool. I think he's here today. And working on getting a meetup, a presentation from the Cypress group about visual testing. That was brought up in an earlier meetup about some information about that. So I think that'll be really cool. As always, if anyone has suggestions or recommendations, please send them my way. And we'll continue to try to make this meetup interesting and informative. I did meet with someone this week who recommended an in-person gathering, either at like a restaurant or a park. Let me know if you guys will be up for that, preferably somewhere where we can all feel safe. But I do hope that this pandemic is winding down. And I know everyone is probably, full of screen time. So maybe getting away and just having some pizza and beverages and chatting would be a fun thing to do. But you guys let me know, and I'll definitely put something on the schedule. I think that'll be fun. Cool. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump in, and you guys feel free to interrupt or ask questions on the chat. Again, just let me know what you think about testing, how you test, and critique my method and see if you can shoot some holes in it and think about improving it. But what I wanted to do is sort of just run through kind of how I do the majority of my testing, especially with APIs. And maybe it'll help some folks. Maybe I'll learn some stuff. I'm sure I'll learn some stuff, but hopefully there'll be value in sharing it. So I also hope I can share my screen today. Last week I had trouble sharing my screen, so let's hope that that's fixed. Everyone see my screen okay?
Yes.
Cool. Just let me know if it freezes. So testing's a huge subject, right? There's a million different ways to do testing. I think the community kind of agrees, or I know they agree, that testing is a good thing. There's various ways that you can make testing extremely hard or extremely streamlined. One way to streamline testing is to really focus on safety, and there's several ways you can do that. One is type safety, like languages like TypeScript or using JS docs to specify your types and some sort of linter or checker to check those types. Other ways is with patterns, like functional programming can give you a lot of safety within your system. But I think everyone agrees that testing is good. There's a great bit of variance on what's best, where to do it, and all of those things. And it gets very opinionated. I kind of think of test in three kind of specific areas. You have unit test, where you're testing a specific unit of code. Usually that's a function or an object or class of something, but you're being very specific about your test. And then I think of integration testing, which I'll talk about today, which is really where you're kind of testing multiple bits of your application through a specific workflow. And the best example I can provide is an endpoint, like an API endpoint. When you make a request, all the way to the response. Usually when that request is made, it's flowing through your business logic, maybe connecting to a service or a data store, doing some stuff, coming back as a response. So I tend to think of integration testing in that way, going from your endpoint all the way through your kind of application layer, to your service layer, and then back through your application layer to the response. So that's what I'll be talking about. And then there's another kind of test type, which is called, or I call it, end-to-end testing. And end-to-end testing is more about simulating the user's experience. So how the user kind of logs in and then clicks on a list of things, and then maybe clicks on a form, enters information in that form, and then hits the submit button. Those types of tests are very much where you're simulating, you're writing tests, simulating what a user is actually doing. And those tests have typically been pretty slow, but also very brittle, because there's a lot of moving parts and things change. But there is some tools out there, one Cypress, that makes that end-to-end testing, because that's really high signal, right? You're emulating exactly what the user is doing. So they're very valuable, but again, difficult to manage. But hopefully we'll see a presentation by Cypress, who has made a lot of headways in that end-to-end testing space. But today we'll talk about integration testing. And there's several different test libraries. All of them are really good. I use Tape. Number one, it's small, and it's focused, right? There's not like a million methods to remember. You have, an assertion, okay, equal, deep equal. And then when you're done with your test, it's end. So I'll be using that today, but Jest is super popular on the front end side. There's Aba and Mocha and a ton of testing frameworks to check out in the Node ecosystem. And again, I invite you all to check them out and kind of pick the one that works best for you. I'll also be using a couple of helper libraries. One is called Test Server, and Test Server basically just allows me to dynamically spin up a web server instance per test and close that instance per test. So I get isolation. When I run my test, each test I write, I want to make sure that that test can't be affected by any other test in my system. I want them to be isolated when they run. And I'll use Test Server for that. And then finally, we'll use a tool called Fetch Mock. And I don't know if you guys have heard of test spies or test mocks, but we'll talk about mocking a little bit today. So, the kind of scenario we're going to do is we're going to work on a single endpoint for a movie review application. So everybody be thinking of your favorite review of Justice League. Has everyone seen the 4-hour Justice League Snyder's Cut? Yeah, I don't know what everyone else thought about it, but I thought it was much better than the original Justice League, for what that's worth. But anyway, that's what we'll be doing. Is we're just going to be creating an endpoint for a movie review app, and super simple. Post a review. We give the review a title, some content, and a rating, star rating 1 through 5 or whatever. But before we actually do that, we're going to write our test first. And just to kind of walk through TDD. Does anyone know what TDD stands for?
Test-driven development.
Right, test-driven development. And it is something that you either love or hate, right? But I'm going to go through kind of how you would go about doing that. And, you know, test-driven development, you usually start by writing the test first. So we'll write our test first and in this index test file. And just to show, in our index file, there's nothing there. So there's no code. So we're going to write our test first and kind of walk through this process together. Okay. Oops. We'll get there. Okay. So first thing we get is our test library, and then we're going to pull in a couple of tools. We're going to pull in our test server. And we're going to pull in a fetch library. And one of the things about integration test, I like to test the API very much like a developer would call the API. I think that's a good way to do it. If a developer looks at your test, then they should be able to say, okay, I can figure out how to call this API. Not that test should be necessarily your documentation, but I think it's a good kind of approach, especially with TDD, because you kind of think outside in. You're like, as a developer, how would I want to call this API? What information would I want to give it? And then we're going to pull in our app. Let's see. So we're going to actually do this a little different. We're going to pull in Express. And then we're going to pull in our function that's in the index file. So this will be our post reviews. And that's just from index. So when you're testing, usually you have, 4 distinct kind of phases or steps in the test. You have a setup, and then you have your actual execution of the code that you're wanting to test. And then you have an assertion where you're wanting to validate that the code executed correctly. And then you have kind of this tear down process. So for our setup, what we're going to do is we're going to create an Express app. And then we're going to add our endpoint. Yeah, okay, so just let me know if we break again. So here we're doing our setup, and we're creating an Express app, and we're adding this post reviews function to the app. And then what we're going to do is create a server, and we'll use our test server. And all this does is it basically listens on a dynamic port. So then when I do my execution, I've got this server.url that I can call, and I don't really have to care if it's what port it's running on or anything like that. So with that, we're just going to use fetch, and we'll get a result. And we'll just call, we'll actually do an await server.url and plus API movie reviews and method post and headers, content type, application JSON, and then we'll give it a body, and that body is going to be a title. We'll say my review of Justice League, and body, some awesome words, and a rating. Give it a 4. All right. So that's our fetch. So we need to make this function async. And then finally, we want to assert. So we're going to assert with the t.ok. And the result, we want it to return an OK true. And then finally, we'll tear down with a server.close. And that'll close our server. And since it's async, it should end the process. Now there's a question, does fetch handle keeping up with session and cookies? Yes, it does. So you can, you can give it various settings, but if you have cookies set, it will pass them on. But most of the time with this testing, it should keep the session and cookies in sync. But most of the time, like in my test, I'm passing in authorization bearer tokens versus cookies, missing an S in a sync tool. Yeah. Cool. All right. So this is our test. Now, the first time that we run it, it should fail. And that's kind of part of test-driven development. You want to write your test and then your implementation code. And there's various ways to do that. Like you can write a little bit at a time and go back and forth. I tend to just get a full kind of test baked in. And now I'm going to go to the application code. And basically start to write our application. So we're going to want to import. We're going to import a validation library. Computer's going nuts here. And this validation library I'm using, I've talked before about, is Zod, but basically it's going to allow us to validate our incoming data. And regardless of how you do it, you want to make sure that you always, you never trust the client, even if you're the client. You always want to make sure that the first thing you check after your auth Z stuff and valid sessions and things is the data. Make sure that it's valid data. And then then we're going to make a call to a service, and then we're going to return the response. So let's just go ahead and validate our data. If it's valid, we'll get a success back, and the data object will contain the data, and the error object will contain an error if it's not valid. So we're destructuring there, and we're going to call review safe parse on the request.body. And then if it's not successful, then we're going to return a status of, I don't know, 500 for now, and any issues that the schema validation had. So our schema looks like this. It's an object, and it can have an ID that's optional, and it has a title. It's a string, and it has a body. That's a string. And finally, a rating, that's a number. And again, we can kind of add more specifics to this content. So like the number, maybe we want the max to be 5, right? It can't be more than 5 stars. Body, we could say, you know, the link can be 5,000, and title, the link can be as max of 100 or something. So we can do that. And yeah, that's our first step. And then the second thing is we're going to want to call our data service, but and then once we do that, we're going to return some response. So I'm just going to go ahead and put a response here. Okay, false. And then we can run our test again. So we can come down here and run our test. And let's see. We are getting, we cannot find module, the index. Oh yeah. So one of the things that I'm doing is using Node's new ESM syntax. And in your package JSON, you set type equal to module. But when you do that, one of the things about that is when you require using path names, you have to put the extension on there, or at least I haven't found a way around that. And I think that's probably good. It's just easy to forget. So you have to put the extension there. And that's what this error means, is it couldn't load that file because it didn't exist, because it didn't. It needs a .js on it. So cool. Now I just got some bad code. Index. Don't need the equal sign. Okay, and let's see. Let's make sure I ran yarn, and maybe that package is missing. But this is part of the test. Now we actually get a fail, right? So operator okay, we expected true and got false. So that's good. And that's kind of the test-driven part. You write your test and you keep changing your code until you get closer and closer to getting it to work. So the next thing we need to do is actually do a fetch call to our service. So what we'll do is open up index, and we're not going to import fetch because we're going to make it available globally. But we will kind of import this URL. So we'll use hyper. Or if that doesn't exist, we'll just use play.hyper63.com. And then down here, we're going to do our fetch. And we'll use this URL, this URL here. Okay. And this URL is going to talk to our service, and our service is data, movie, reviews, something like that. And what we want to do is do a post and have headers. And we would add any other header information here, like authorization, bearer token, etc. Then we're going to do our body. And we're going to pass the data. So this data will validate against this review schema. So we know that the data is good, and we'll pass it to our service. And then one of the things we want to do is check and see how the service responds before we convert to JSON. Basically, with fetch, you don't get an error if the server responds with a different status code than 200 or 201. You do get a success as far as like the transaction successfully completed, but the result from the server may be an error. So we're going to check and make sure that the status, if it's not equal to 201, then we're going to tell our client, okay, false, and status, let's give it the same status as what was given, and a message, error. And we would want to be more specific, but that's a good check. And then if it's successful, we're going to return res.json as our result. We need to make this function async. And then finally, we'll do a catch. And if that's an error, we'll return okay, false. Status 500. And this can occur if our service doesn't exist. So just want to try to capture every single case that can happen. And then finally, we get our result, and we'll return the result here. And we can set the status equal to result.status or 201. All right. So that was a lot of code. Hopefully everybody was able to follow. Now, one of the things we're still going to fail because this method is actually failing. So when the fetch goes out, it's actually failing. We can go and look at our test to be sure. So what we may want to do is do a console log and print out the result. And hopefully we see like some sort of status here. Let's see, we get a response. And that's not what we were hoping for, but that's good information. Let's look at index. So we return that. Or wait. Figured it would return this okay false. Let's see this real quick. Is everybody still able to see my screen? Or did I lock up?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, cool. Okay, so that's okay. Even if we're getting that response, we're actually getting a response that it's not able to, oh, I know what we're doing wrong. On our test, we are not converting it to JSON. Oops. Yep. So you can either call await again, or you can do then res equals JSON, res.json, response.json. Either way. So now we're still failing, but yeah, we're getting invalid type, object undefined. Cool. So that's basically saying that something's required and it's not there. We're sending our title, body, and rating. We made ID optional, title, body, rating. Received undefined. Oh, so it's not getting the whole object, and that's because we're not converting it to JSON in the body. There we go. Okay. So let's see. Save that. Okay. Yep. So fetch is not defined. So the way we're going to solve that is we're going to use a global fetch. So what we can do is in our test, let's come up here and say global this dot fetch equals fetch. And now this fetch will be set on anything that is imported. And one of the reasons that we do this, even though globals are usually a bad thing, fetch is built into the browser by default. And it's been my preference, or I've found out that, you know, kind of emulating what the browser system does makes code more compatible over time. So we're sort of making fetch global, and that allows all of our dependencies to see it. And now it can see fetch, and it does get okay, false, status 401 error, which is good. It's making the call to the service, and it's getting a 401 back. But in our test, we want our test to run in this isolated environment and only test our code. So what we're going to use is a mock to abstract our service so that it only tests our code. And this mock will actually return back exactly what we tell it to return. We'll use a tool called fetch mock to do this. And it's called fetch mock. And mocking is a way of allowing your code to run, but then it sort of injects via like a dependency injection the fake kind of service. In this case, we're injecting a fake fetch, because fetch is not a library you write. It's more of a standard library. So we're injecting this fake fetch, or this mock, and we're going to tell it this is how it should behave. And this will allow for us to write more deterministic tests, and we're not depending on a service to be running when the tests run. And there's a lot of debate on the pros and cons of this. And I think if you do most of your integration tests this way, and then have some end-to-end tests that cover the full spectrum, works pretty well. But your mileage may vary. So with fetch mock, what we'll do is we're going to mock a post message. And this post message is going to call HTTPS play hyper63.com/data and /movie reviews. And then the response we want it to come back with is a status 201 and a body. And we're just going to say, okay, true for this. And then the last thing we want to do, we mock out all of our calls, and then we return sandbox. And sandbox will create this fake fetch and pass it to our express service. So now, if I run this, I should get a passing test. Pretty cool. But the nice thing about the mock is I know now if I run in the CI, the only thing that's going to break my test is my code. As long as the service returns what it's supposed to return, and I'm mocking that, then the only thing that can break this test is my code. And let's show an example of how that can happen. For example, let's change the review, and let's say we misspell title, right? So if our test we misspell title, it should fail because title is required and it's undefined, and we have this misspelling title. Or if someone comes along and says, you know what, you need to add the year of the movie, or the name of the movie, right? So you're doing a review, you need to add the name of the movie. That would be good. So you come up here and you add movie. And then all of your test, now has this dependency on the schema. So all your tests should break that's not including movie in it. And that's a great way to test regressions. So once you have all of these kind of reliable tests, you make a change to your code base, they should fail and give you signal and say, okay, you know what, I might need to update that test to support that new schema. And then the last thing I want to close with is sad path testing. And I won't go through it. I have it on the blog post, but you not only do you want to write happy path test, but you also want to write tests, and I call them sad path tests, but basically tests that expect to fail. And, you know, to keep it simple, in your sad path test, you would say, you know what, my assertion is not okay, right? And you would have tests that, you know, for example, what if I'm trying to make a GET request instead of a POST request? Should that return an error? Or if I'm passing a movie review but not setting the content type, maybe I want to write a test for that to make sure that I'm always making sure I'm testing for that case, or I'm testing for no data. Yeah, the evil path, right? And you can really go nuts for that. Like, you can think of a million evil ways to do things. My recommendation is, you know, depending on how much time you have to implement a feature, is to think of maybe 1 to 2, but then create some discipline over time. As a bug comes up, then implement a test before you fix that bug. Even if the bug is super easy to fix, if it's reported out in the field or by QA, go ahead and implement a test to prove that that bug exists. That way, when you fix it, not only will you have confidence that it's fixed, but you create this a regression library so that that bug can't pop up again. Or if it does, it shows on your radar. And then the last thing, I'll just show the browser, but CI. You always want your test to run in CI, and GitHub has made that really, really easy. So with GitHub, you can create a file called test YAML in .github workflows, and then every time you push your code, it's going to essentially run yarn test and yell at you if it fails. So it can't be simpler to add automated integration test these days with GitHub. If you use GitHub, GitLab has a testing framework that's just as easy as well. But anyway, Azure DevOps, the main thing is whatever flavor you use, do it. Do automated testing, because that's when the real value that your future self appreciates or will appreciate. So with that, I'm glad I made it all the way through, but is there any questions? And sorry if I went a little long.
No apologies. That was great.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for your time. And, you know, again, I know testing's not necessarily the funnest subject, but it's something that if you get proficient at it, it can save you a lot of pain. And curious to know if anyone has other ways of doing integration tests and or any tips and tricks. So just let me know. Cool. Yeah, I'm glad you're going to play with Zod. Yeah, it's a really neat library. Just use version 3 or Zod at next. And if you have any questions, let me know. I'll be happy to help. I actually, the question is, do I ever use Postman? I actually have a favorite tool, and it may just be me, but over the years, Postman has gotten kind of verbose and kind of complicated in its own right. At least that's my humble opinion. It's a great tool, but it has gotten kind of complicated. So I've been using this tool called Insomnia, which is a crazy name, but let me see if I can share my screen again. But it's I don't know, it's got a nice dark mode to it, and you've got this nice dashboard, and when you go and create a test, it's just got everything right in front, right? Your auth, it's got like all your stuff right there, query stuff, body. And anyway, I just found it to be super easy to use. You can actually run it headless and all that stuff. So check that out if you aren't married to Postman.